Because I know better than to ask people on the internet to actually watch the whole video before manifesting their own impotent rage in the comment section, I'll just get straight to the point. Being pro-business is stupid for the same reason as being anti-business is stupid. In essence, it's like saying you're pro-heart health or pro-digestion. You'll literally die if your heart stops or if you don't eat food, so either you're saying it as some sort of psyop, in which case you're either the dumbest person currently living or you think I am, or else you're secretly a synth that's trying and failing to blend into normal human society. And now that I've got the anti-laissez-faire charms hung up, let's get on with the more sophisticated adult talk. The reason I say being pro-business is a stupid stance is not because I'm anti-business, and I'm not anti-business for the same reason as I'm not anti-food. When you get right down to it, business is just the means by which we change our time and human energy into resources and then convert those resources into the goods and services we need to live, and so by also maintain our society and all the collective benefits thereof. That said, I treat business the same way that Thomas Paine treats government. In shortest terms, at its absolute best, it's a necessary evil, and at worst, it's a plague upon humanity itself. The reason I think this is, as I've already stated elsewhere, any organized body in which individuals have a personal investment, whether it be political, ideological, religions, or biological, in the case of a living organism, its first and foremost allegiance is and will always be to the preservation and continuation of itself. Anything else beyond that is tertiary at best. For those of you who missed those previous videos, my thinking goes like this. In a platonic sense, the function of a business is supposed to be to produce products and services for the community that the individuals within can't produce for themselves. And in order to do this, they need to turn a profit, in the same way and for the same reason that a living organism needs to regularly intake more calories than they burn. Failure to do this, even for a short period, will result in death for both organization and organism alike. However, the consequence of this dire imperative in both cases is that, over time, evolutionary pressures tend to sculpt their entire form and identity around it. The human body, for instance, is really just a food processing tube with a complex locomotion and feeding aperture grafted on which, in its quest for more sustenance, often transforms the environment around itself in ways that other organisms will find useful in their requiro victus. Just so, a corporation is a money siphon by design, which on occasion outputs useful ideas, products, and resources. And on top of this, since we live in a world of finite energy and resources, each and every organization and organism is and will always be in perpetual competition with every other one for access to that limited pool. The reason they don't just amicably split the pool is because each of their survival costs are different. Larger, more complex bodies require more sustenance than smaller, leaner ones. And also because most will be parasites if given the opportunity, since it is always more profitable to take what someone else produced than it is to produce for yourself. Also because there is always a certain amount of uncertainty in the environment, whether we're talking about ecological biomes or economic markets, the prudent needs are to keep to oneself a certain buffer as insurance against the lean times that are all but guaranteed within a long enough projection. So, to sum up, the interests of any business always are, always have been, and will always be to produce as little as possible while charging as much as possible, thus maximizing revenue and minimizing costs, thus maximizing profits, and so more securely ensuring its continual survival and proliferation. This is why I describe capitalism as Darwinian economics. But a business is not a force in and of itself. It depends on the compliance of workers and the loyalty of customers in order to produce anything or to have any revenue whatsoever. And all of them have to do the same cost-benefit calculus as the business itself, meaning the former always wants to work less and get paid more, while the latter wants to pay less and purchase more. In other words, the natural interests of both the worker and the customer stand mutually opposed to those of the business. This is why I am not now, nor will I ever be pro-business, as everything that's pro-business is necessarily anti-worker and anti-customer. And since the worker and customer are the powerhouse of the market, just as the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, being anti either of them is similar to being opposed to your own digestive system. But contrarily, everything that's pro-market is always necessarily anti-business, which, when taken beyond the point of market insolvency, is equally as unproductive as being pro-business. That said, the reason I will always come down on the side of the market rather than the business is because the market can and will generate new businesses to suit its evolving demands, whereas business, if left unregulated and unchallenged, will always end up consuming the market to sustain itself. Think about every exploitative, anti-competitive business practice you've ever heard of. Enshittification, shrinkflation, monopolization, products as services, stock buybacks, creative accounting, non-compete agreements, automation, offshoring, monetized addiction, wage theft, planned obsolescence, leverage schemes, lobbying, pretty much everything to do with the marketing and media industries, tax evasion, corporate subsidies, clickbait, slop content, etc., etc. The reason all of these things are as pervasive as they are right now, and are only getting more so as the real economy decomposes, is that they're all great for business in the short term, but they're cancerous for the worker, the customer, and ultimately the market in general, which is why there's supposed to be regulations in place to rein them in. The reason why there's not, or if there are, why they aren't enforced, is that we're not in the era of nation-states anymore, but of economic states. Just a reminder for those who are unfamiliar, a nation is a group of ethnically and/or culturally united people, and a state is just another word for government. In the 21st century, even the ostensibly democratic states aren't of, by, and for the people anymore, if they ever were to begin with, but of, by, and for the highest bidders, and therefore the interests of the state now parallel those of the biggest economic contributors, aka the multinational corporations, since without their consolidated infrastructure you wouldn't have an economy, and thus you couldn't have a functional state anymore, since, contrary to some impressively stupid people's beliefs, the state cannot just snap their fingers and magically create jobs and prosperity out of the ether. In short, they need business to facilitate the equitable exchange of labor for capital, similar to how the heart or the lungs need each other to keep the body's resource and energy supplies flowing. The reason I say this is a problem worth solving is that the smarter, aka the more profitable strategy for any business, especially the larger, less flexible ones with more capital to spare, is to manipulate the state and the market to undermine their competition rather than to invest time and energy into fairly outcompeting them. Thing is, if every business does this, it'll divert the preponderance of market pressures downward onto the productive classes, the workers and small businesses, and away from the possessing and managing classes, which is where they should be. And without the real omnipresent threat of fiscal starvation driving wages up and prices down, eventually the workers won't be able to afford the products they're making, which drives down consumption, which drives down fertility and productivity, as the main incentive most people have to be productive is to provide for their children, which ultimately tilts the market into a death spiral from which very few ever recover. This is why I say that the interests of business, and thus business itself, are intrinsically opposed to the very concept of a free market. And this is why a government which responds to the will of the productive class, i.e. the people who are net contributors to the labor market, must be in place and must institute pro-market, not pro-business regulations to curb any form of business practice that's not strictly adhered to the spirit of good sportsmanship, which is an important distinction. As if we were to stick to the letter of the law, they would simply find the nearest and cheapest way to skirt around it without having to actually abide by their end of the social contract. Of course, since I know somebody's going to bring it up if I don't, the fundamental flaw of communism is their thinking the government is somehow fundamentally immune to all the same corrosive forcings I've just laid out, which is obviously absurd given that it's comprised of all the same cellular types as the corporate sector. And the folly of the libertarians and liberals is their miscomprehension of the rationality of the average man, by which I mean they tend to take as being self-evident the rationality of communal mutualism, aka symbiosis. But for the individual who, recall, owes his or her first and primary allegiance to themselves, not to abstract notions of goodness or to an external system, it is rational to participate in any system if and only if they stand to gain more and lose less working within its frame than they would have on their own. The reason all systems inevitably become unstable is because no system can ever generate more energy than what was fed into it. That's not how physics works. And when enough people realize their investments aren't yielding sufficient returns, they'll divest, which causes the ascending feedback spiral to reverse, which is why empires always collapse and why utopias are physically and logically impossible. But as always, that's all just been my read on the situation. Let me know what you think in the usual ways. And while you're there, be sure to like and subscribe if you're of a similar mind on this as me, or even if you're not but are willing to have a cordial dialogue about it. Also, be sure to check out my merch store or have a glint at my books over on Amazon. Join up as a member here or over on Patreon for $1 per month, or come join me for free on my alternate channels to help me give YouTube the business. And with all that shilling out of the way, until next time, my friends, as always, stay safe, stay sane, and always remember, anyone who's selling you a dream is just trying to put you to sleep. Peace be upon you.